Right, now, talking of personalities, President Trump has always said that dark forces and the deep state were out to get him. Now, after revelations of a resistance within the White House, does the president have a point? If you think, no, Trump's paranoid, then call me on 0345 6060 973, or maybe you think the officials really are working against him, in which case text to 84850, or maybe you think it's just politics as usual, in which case tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC, and of course you can watch us live on Facebook and you can comment there too. Is Trump right when he says there are dark forces out to get him? It's beginning to look like it. All through the election campaign, Donald Trump said he was going to drain the swamp. And he then said, since he's become president, he's talked time and again about there being dark forces, the deep state, as it's called, that are there, are out to get him and want to stop him putting in place his agenda. There are some similar arguments that get made in this country, that there's a deep state at work inside Whitehall that wants to water Brexit down, that wants to push May in a direction where Brexit doesn't really mean Brexit. Now, very often you see this stuff and you think, wow, this is just loopy conspiracy theory. This is just crackers. But something happened last week that was really, really interesting. There was this anonymous article that appeared in the New York Times purporting to come from a senior official inside the administration saying that there are a group of people there in the West Wing and within those boundaries, that he says, we have vowed to do what we can to preserve our democratic institutions whilst thwarting Mr. Trump's more misguided impulses until he's out of office. So what they're saying is, there's a group of them there trying to stop Trump putting into place his agenda. I would emphasise the agenda upon which he was elected. Now, there's been a huge witch hunt going on to try and find out who wrote the article, and denials coming from several. This was Trump's reaction to the New York Times article this week.
We have somebody in what I call the failing New York Times that's talking about he's part of the resistance within the Trump administration. This is what we have to deal with. And, you know, the dishonest media, because you people deal with it as well as I do.
So that's Trump talking about, and using that term, resistance. People are working for the government, and yet they're trying to stop the government doing what it's supposed to be doing. It begins to make you think that actually this idea that there is a deep state isn't some crackpot conspiracy theory. This is what Vice President Pence had to say on the matter.
I think it's a disgrace. The anonymous editorial published in the New York Times represents a new low in American journalism. And I think the New York Times should be ashamed. And I think whoever wrote this anonymous editorial should also be ashamed as well.
So really interesting. And today, John Sopel, again in the Mail on Sunday, but John Sopel today, of course, and he, of course, is the BBC's America correspondent. Famously, if you remember, there was the press conference when Sopel got up to ask a question, and the president, knowing full well who John Sopel was, of course, the president said, "Excuse me, can you please identify which media organisation you're from?" And John Sopel says, "I have the honour to represent the BBC." And Trump says, "Oh yeah, that's another beauty, isn't it?" So he was basically accusing the BBC, along with CNN and others, as being fake news. But John Sopel, I've known John Sopel many, many years, and he is a very, very perceptive and good journalist. And he talks today under a headline, "Trump's enemies are proving his conspiracy theories true." And he says, so what legitimacy does the writer have in declaring that he or she is the guardian of US democracy? For better or worse, the ballot box is where elections are decided, and in November 2016, the American people spoke. If you're unhappy about the administration's direction of travel, you have the choice of resigning and fighting the Trump agenda at the next election. And John Sopel is absolutely right, because there's almost nothing that Trump has done that he didn't promise he would do during that election campaign. He said, I'm going to do all these things. That's exactly what he's trying to do. And now he's being resisted from within the White House. Trump's enemies are proving his conspiracy theories true. And I wonder, added on to that, whether this could be said to be true of this country as well. Because isn't it interesting that David Davis produces a white paper as to how we're going to handle Brexit, to be told by the Prime Minister, well, that's very good of you, David, But we don't actually need that, because our civil servant here, Ollie Robbins, has produced something that's much more to my liking. Is the whole of Whitehall working to undermine the government and the manifesto upon which they were elected? Is there a deep state at work? I wonder what Pat in Stepney Green makes of that. Good morning.
Oh, good morning. Yeah, look, I mean, it was apparent as soon as Donald Trump got the gig that people would be against him because they all wanted Hillary the witch Clinton.
The witch? You call her the... Why are you so disparaging about the lovely Hillary?
Well, she seems an hard-nosed bee. You know, she seems an hard-nosed.
All right, fair enough. No, listen, Pat, she hates me. I was being a bit sarcastic. She said some very nasty things about me. So, all right, so Pat, so you think this is... So, when Trump talks about the dark forces working against him, you believe there is some truth in this, yeah?
Well, I mean, it's like Brexit. I mean, there's dark forces working against that. And also, there's dark forces working against the Russian state because Putin would not join the European project. He didn't want nothing to do with the liberal West. So they're all ganging up on him as well.
How do we change this, Pat? Because we've had, we've voted for Brexit, we've voted for Trump, we've voted for fundamental changes in both cases, and it's proving a bit harder to get there, isn't it?
Yeah, because these people are so wealthy and so much power, and they're like a cabal of American, European, globalists that they want a one world order.
Yeah, and some would say the Bilderbergers. I've no doubt. Pat, thank you, and Pat thinks it is true. I think a growing number of people feel that there are some quite dark forces at work that don't necessarily like the way we vote in elections. John is calling from Formby, a regular caller to this show. Good morning, John.
Yes, good morning, Nigel.
So is Trump right to say there are dark forces against him?
Oh, absolutely. I think the root of the problem is that the cosy establishment has had it too good for too long. They see their entire way of life being threatened, and they're employing sabotage tactics. They want people within the government and the media to give Trump a rocky ride. They want him to fail, and they're doing everything they can to achieve that.
Do you see a parallel, John, here with Brexit?
Oh, absolutely. It's the same thing. It's like a football match where your team's losing 1-0, you score a valid equaliser, and the bent referee says it's not going to 1-1.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I'm just enraged at the role the civil service have played through the whole Brexit negotiations here. And I remember, John, little anecdote for you. I remember going into the West Wing to see Steve Bannon, and he was there in his office, and he was the president's key advisor, and I was having a conversation with him and kind of noticed that he was kind of talking back to me in very whispered tones, and Steve just assumed that everything he said and did was being listened to by the security services in the USA. So he was absolutely convinced that there was a deep state there that was out to damage the president. The question is, whether it's in America, John, or whether it's here, how do we stop the deep state from acting against the democratically expressed will of the people? What do we do about it?
Oh, that's a very good question. We need more whistleblowers for a start.
Yeah.
And the whole culture has to be changed.
It's a heck of a job, isn't it? Draining the swamp or completely changing the way Whitehall operates. So it's a heck of a job, isn't it?
It is, yes. But I think it can be done. You've got to have very clear rules, and people have got to stick to them, and there's got to be compliance by the establishment. They're very good at imposing compliance on us. Well, it's high time we impose it on them.
Not easy, John. I thank you, and I have to say, to me, the big difficulty is just how do we deal with this? John is calling from Glasgow. Good morning, John.
Morning, Nigel. There has always been a deep state. Anybody who's ever watched Yes Minister will realise that.
Yeah, that's a good point. That was, it just sort of reminds me what a fantastic programme that was, wasn't it?
It was indeed, and the civil service in this country haven't necessarily changed. It's all about how clever or how skillful the politician is at getting the civil servant to to actually implement and do what he actually wants, because I seem to recall the civil servant, I think it was Nigel Hawthorne, spent a great deal of time trying to thwart what Jim Harker wanted to do.
Yes. Now, there was the wonderful episode in which they decided to cut back civil service numbers, and by the time they'd finished the exercise, there were actually more of them, I remember.
Well, Nigel Hawthorne, as well, as far as Donald Trump being perhaps, shall we say, unstable or mad, there's nothing new in that either, because I seem to recall this country had a mad head of state in the form of King George III. And it didn't prevent this country from being hugely successful, because I seem to recall, even though we had a mad head of state, we defeated Napoleon, we won Trafalgar, and we won the battle at Waterloo.
And we founded Australia, but at the same time we lost the American colonies. No, but
well, that's right.
Yeah,
this might be the chance to get the colonies back.
Well, I hadn't really expected the phone call to go quite in that direction, John. But how do we stop this, John? I mean, we're supposed to live in democracies. We, the people, are supposed to empower governments on a manifesto. And if we find that actually it is the state employees that think, oh, no, we can't have this, this is not acceptable, and in many ways you could argue that the model of the European Union was set up on the basis that officials knew better than voters what was good for them and the future direction of their countries. How do we turn this round, John? Can we turn it round?
Well, the only thing that the electorate can do is vote in politicians who are determined to implement their agenda. And support them, because Trump's getting obviously hugely destabilised. There are forces attempting to destabilise. Well, the only thing that the electorate can do is ensure, for example, the upcoming elections which Trump's party is facing, is that they support them again.
Well, do you know what, John? I think all of what's happened in the last 2 weeks in America is all about the midterm elections, and we'll talk about those in the course of this hour. Jim says on Facebook, it's not the deep state, just people with different points of view. Jim, they're entitled to have different points of view, but if they're working for an elected US president who is carrying out the things he told the American people would do, surely their job in a democracy is to make sure he's able to do them, not to be the resistance against him carrying them out. That's how it seems to me. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's 11:15. So Donald Trump is having a very tough time, and much of it is coming from his own staff and his own side, as somebody writes anonymously an article in the New York Times saying that there are people working within the White House trying to stop the president, resisting the president, doing the things he wants to do and doing the things he was elected on. Is he right to think there is perhaps a deep state at work? But the problems for Trump and the criticism for Trump is not just coming from within the White House. Actually, there is now an all-out attack against him. Why? Well, that's because there are some very crucial midterm elections coming up in November that could, if he loses them, lead not just to complete legislative deadlock on Capitol Hill, but actually talk that a whole impeachment process could be gone through. Now, we saw this, of course, with Clinton going back a few years, but if you get to that stage, it'd be very difficult for him as president to almost do anything. So it's a very big, crucial time. And former President Barack Obama. Now, he's surfaced and really put out now his most pointed critique to date of President Trump. On Friday, he spoke for over an hour before 1,000 students in Illinois. And it really is the first time since Trump became president that he's all out criticized him.
The status quo pushes back. Sometimes the backlash comes from people who are genuinely, if wrongly, fearful of change. More often it's manufactured by the powerful and the privileged, who want to keep us divided and keep us angry and keep us cynical, because that helps them maintain the status quo and keep their power and keep their privilege. And you happen to be coming of age during one of those moments. It did not start with Donald Trump. He is a symptom, not the cause. He's just capitalizing on resentments that politicians have been fanning for years. A fear and anger that's rooted in our past, but it's also born out of the enormous upheavals that have taken place in your brief lifetimes.
Well, the president, of course, did not take this lying down. He was on his way to North Dakota on Friday evening to give one of his big rallies, and this is what he had to say.
Somebody, a very popular guy here, was just interviewing me. You know who I'm talking about, great guy. And he said, what do you think of President Obama's speech? And I said, I'm sorry, I watched it, but I fell asleep. I found he's very good for sleeping.
Well, unusual really for Trump. Normally, you'd expect him to come back and punch hard in the ribs, but this time, actually, for once, laughing it off. I think Trump should do more of that sometimes, just laugh things off. But there is a big attempt to stop him putting in place his agenda. He's talked about dark forces. Many have said it's a paranoid conspiracy theory. But when John Sopel, the BBC's America correspondent, says today, actually, in this article, Trump's enemies are proving his conspiracy theories true, I wonder, is there a deep state at work in America, and is it at work in this country trying to thwart Brexit? Because I kind of think that it is. What does Nick from Croydon think? Good morning, Nick.
Hello, Nigel. Morning to you. The one thing about this that I found strange is what spy would write an article for the New York Times, indeed any newspaper, setting out I am a spy, which is effectively what the article in the New York Times says. That strikes me as very odd. And the only answer, the sensible answer I got to that, was that it's people within the deep state who I'm sure exist, talking to each other still. They've still not got over the fact that Trump won, Clinton lost. And this is them reassuring themselves that they are, after all, good guys, rather than the election results showing the bad guys, the losers. I find that very strange.
I mean, the point of the article, Nick, is not for a spy to self-identify or to confirm their existence. The point of the article is to say the president is unstable, it's chaos within the White House, he's dangerous for the democratic values and economic well-being of America, and we're here resisting him. The point is they're basically saying, Nick, he's unfit to be president, aren't they?
Yes, but we've had now 3 or 4 different versions of this from 3 or 4 different people. There was a book by the staffer who had met him for 15 minutes or so in his lifetime, and he produced 300 pages based on that. There was the doctor who said he'd seen him on TV and said Trump was mad. I mean, there's just endless stories of these, and it's all variations on the same theme. You know, this bloke's a bad person, I don't like him, therefore you, the electorate, don't vote for him. And it's just this reassuring noises for the same people talking to themselves, for the rest of us.
But it's wrong, isn't it?
I think it's just so much smoke and noise.
Is it wrong, Nick? Is it wrong, or is this how it always is? I mean, we had a phone call earlier talking about Jim Hacker and the Yes Minister back in the 80s. Is it always like this, perhaps?
I think maybe it is. I feel sure that it is, in fact. But the only way you can deal with that is to put in control measures that ministers can give people a task, and those people are responsible for completing those tasks. And if they don't, there needs to be some kind of remedy for the ministers. You've not done what you've been asked to do. Therefore, you will no longer stay in your post.
Yeah, well, a few sackings might be helpful. Nick, I thank you very much indeed for your call. President Trump, unfortunately, has been subjected to the condemnation of his administration from an anonymous source. It proves there are dark forces at work, says David. John Sopel takes a very similar view. It would not surprise me if there were dark forces out to get Trump, says BB. The biggest threat to our democracy is the civil service. They need to be drastically reformed, says Max in Cumbria. What is happening to Trump is happening to you and Brexit. There is an establishment trying everything to quash our democratic vote. If Brexit doesn't happen, as I said previously, democracy will be dead, says Peter. So far, a lot of you are actually saying Sopel is right. They are out to get Trump. They are in many ways out to get Brexit. Please someone tell me that you think it's right they should be stopping the president doing things, that you think it's right that the Brexit process should be slowed down and diluted. 0345 6060 973. Do we need protecting from ourselves And if that's the case, maybe it is the job of a civil service to do it. Certainly, the founders of the European Union firmly, John Monnet, firmly believed that democracy was a very inefficient process and there were better ways of handling these things. Claire is calling from Tottenham Court Road in central London. Good morning, Claire.
Yes, good morning. Well, I think that Donald Trump is wise to be wary of people with Machiavellian intent working against him, because thank God they are. They've realised just what the American people have voted for, and the patriots are trying to protect their country. Donald Trump, his only concern is to dismantle every single benefit from the Obama era, whether it's to the benefit of the American people or not. I've got relatives in America, and they were terrified that the Affordable Health Care Bill would be abolished, because they've got members in their family who have got pre-existing health conditions, and they would be excluded from care, whereas at the moment they're covered forcibly by their insurers. But Nigel, we've got the same thing going on in Britain, because the nearer Jeremy Corbyn gets to number 10, the more likely the Cayman Islands tax havens will go, the British Virgin Island tax havens will go. We'll get our railways and our utilities back. We'll get social services funded properly. We'll probably get the nursing bursaries back. But many people do not want that, because a lot of people
are you saying the deep state would stop Corbyn?
They're trying, but fortunately, the British people see through it. They see through the invented anti-Semitism, the debacle, the so-called invented non-patriotism of this man's stance. And the Labour Party is now, as we were told by LBC, I don't know because they don't go into these things much, the Labour Party is now 4 points clear of the Tories. So therefore, you can do your best to bring down a good man, but if in Donald Trump's case it's necessary because he's working to the disbenefit of the American people.
But if Claire, if he was elected, right? If he was elected to get rid of affordable health care, as you describe it, right? Obamacare, he would call it, and he was going to put in place, as he said...
Well, that's a pejorative, and you know full well,
hang on. Well, whichever way you argue it can be. But the point is, if he was elected to do it, is it right that bureaucrats and civil servants should try and stop him doing it?
But the fact is, Nigel, he didn't have anything to replace it with which was comparable or better. What he wanted to replace it with would exclude people with pre-existing conditions.
No, you're missing the point, Claire. The big point is, should our bureaucracies, our civil service, should they have the power to effectively undermine elected leaders?
If it's because they're saving... Look, you could say that in Roman times, they had no right to bring down Nero because he was the elected emperor. They had no right to bring down Julius Caesar, but he was turning the state into a dictatorship. Sometimes, Nigel, irrespective of what the electorate have been told or fooled into believing, if the people closest to Trump realise that what he's doing is insane, some of his measures are so extreme. I mean, they gave him the benefit of the doubt. They said some of it they agreed with, like, because they were going to benefit from tax.
So you think that actually it is correct and proper at times for administrations and civil services to temper what elected leaders are doing?
Nigel, stop being so naive, and this so sanctimonious drivel is really annoying.
What are you talking about?
Stone, for heaven's sake, if they can see the country is going down a path which is detrimental, they have a patriotic duty to do something about it. But if people have voted for it, what if people have voted for it? But people, if you ask the general public, they probably vote to return capital punishment. But we've moved on from capital punishment.
If they want capital punishment, shouldn't they have it, Claire?
Capital punishment, for heaven's sake! Now we're slipping into the lunacy. Capital punishment.
I wouldn't vote for it, Claire. But if actually in a democratic society that's what people wanted,
don't you understand what these people are trying to do? It's got nothing against Donald Trump personally. Donald Trump is the worst thing to have ever happened to America. He's not fit to be a president. He doesn't have the intellect or the education to be a president.
4.1% growth. It's looking pretty good for many people in America, isn't it?
Again. Unemployment started going down in America from 2011. Yeah. All of this started under the Obama era.
And the lowest black unemployment in the history of the States. Claire, we can argue it all ways. You see him as a force for bad. Maybe there is an argument at times. That civil services should intervene. But I think democracy is what should actually come through, particularly if leaders are doing what they promised the electorate they would do. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's 11:30, and well, American politics is never-ending drama at the moment. I guess with Donald Trump there, it was always going to be interesting, but when you get somebody from inside his own administration writing, saying they're stopping him from doing things, they're acting as the resistance, and then the witch hunt kicks off. And interestingly, one of the words that was used in the article was lodestar, and people found immediately, this is a word that Mike Pence, the Vice President, uses regularly. So all fingers point at the Vice President, and he has given a big interview to CBS and a very strong denial that he's acting in a Machiavellian way to bring down the President. Obama, for the first time really since Trump's been elected, comes and speaks out very strongly against him. What is going on, folks, and we're not talking about it in this country at all at the moment, but we will be, is that in about 60 days' time, there are going to be the mid-term elections in America. So let's have a little look at those. Let's find out what's happening and why those next 60 days are so crucial. Helping me with this is Dr. Tom Packer, specialist in American politics at the University of Durham. Tom, good morning to you.
Good morning, Nigel.
So please explain, because no one's heard this talked about anywhere, please explain to everybody what the midterms are.
The midterms are the elections for Congress, the US's equivalent of Parliament. The House of Representatives, which is half of Parliament, and a third of the Senate are up every 2 years. So they have elections every 2 years for Congress. And Congress is just as powerful as the President, if not much more so. And so it matters a great deal. If the Republicans lose Congress, Trump has much less ability to achieve anything.
Right, so the talk is, from what I've understood of this, that his majority in the Senate looks relatively safe, but it's the House of Representatives, it's rather like the House of Commons, where he could lose his majority. Is there any polling out there, Tom, at the moment to suggest that may well happen?
Yes, there's quite a fair amount of polling at the moment. The House of Representatives has over 400 members who are up every 2 years. So the big picture is what really matters for that. And the polling is showing the Democrats ahead by 8 or 9 points. Now, the lines are biased a bit in favour of the Republicans, but that almost certainly means a Republican majority. I would say, Democratic majority, sorry. I would say that's very, very likely. It would be, like, most estimates are the Republicans have about a fifth chance of holding the House. I think it's less. And I would disagree slightly on the Senate. I think most people, including me, would say the Republicans would probably keep it, but there is a real chance they could lose the Senate. Most of the Senate seats up are in very Republican areas of the country, but there are a few that aren't. So it's quite easy to imagine the Democrats just winning the Senate. Okay. But everything has to go right for them and wrong for the Republicans in the 6 or 7 close races that's going on.
But either way, if he does lose the House of Representatives, I mean, there is talk of this word impeachment, isn't there? That impeachment proceedings would begin. And again, this is a word that people read, they hear talked about, and nobody really understands. Tell us how the impeachment process works, please.
So it's actually taken from the British system. We just haven't used it for hundreds of years. The way it works is if a majority of the House of Representatives impeaches any office holder, including the President, which is what people are talking about this time, it then goes to the Senate, and 2/3 of the Senate have to vote to get rid of him. So if the Democrats win the House, if they decide Donald Trump is dodgy or whatever reason they want, they can impeach him quite easily, but they can't necessarily remove him from office. So lots of your listeners probably remember with President Clinton, he was impeached, but then only half the Senate voted to remove him, and you needed 2/3, so there were 16 votes short. So I think at the moment you'd need some very big new revelations coming out for enough Republicans to defect for 2/3 of the Senate to vote to get rid of him. That has to be more news.
Yeah, yes, on current form, nothing like that is going to happen at all. But isn't it funny? I mean, they've built this system, Tom, with checks and balances, but haven't they almost guaranteed that every president finishes up for the last half of their presidency, effectively, in legislative terms, being a lame duck?
There's a lot in that. I mean, of course, the founding fathers, the people who created the US Constitution, wanted it to be hard to pass stuff, and they didn't believe in political parties, so they didn't quite realize how Congress and the President could polarize against each other. Having said that, if the President endorses policies on the other side of the political spectrum, so actually, if you look at the last 2 years of President Bush's presidency, quite a lot of left-wing policies like subsidizing the banks passed, and that could well happen again, particularly if Donald Trump, who has a very interesting ideological history, ends up agreeing with the Democrats on some issues like trade or public spending. Now, I suspect it will all become a fight about whether he'll be impeached, and that will drown it out. But if President Trump backed the Democrats' agenda, that can make life very interesting.
Yeah, and just finally, Tom, what are the key states for us to watch over the course of these next 60 days?
In terms of the House, I think California and Illinois, there are big Republican majorities that look vulnerable. So California and New York, are particularly important. In terms of the Senate, I think key states to look at are North Dakota, where the Republicans might gain one, and Arizona, where the Democrats might. If the Democrats win both of those, they've got a good chance of winning the Senate. If they lose either one, the Republicans have kept the Senate.
Terrific. Thank you very much indeed. That was Tom Packer, specialist in American politics at the University of Durham, basically saying that where we are now, the odds are stacked against the president for these midterm elections. And that would mean if he loses control of the House of Representatives, basically getting any more significant legislation through for the last half of his term as president would be, I think, pretty close to impossible, is a reasonable way of putting it, and the chances of them launching an impeachment procedure against him pretty high, though it's unlikely, unless more revelations came out about Trump, for that to actually go anywhere, but it could just clog the whole system up. And this on the back, of course, of this all-out assault being launched on him, not just by Obama, but by people who work in his own administration. And I'm asking you, Trump has talked about the deep state. He's talked about people working against him. Many have thought it's absolute conspiracy theory. Greg on Facebook says, did paranoia get a mention? Yeah, Greg, a lot of people said that. But here today, John Sopel, the BBC's North American correspondent, and somebody who I think is viewed as being a very good journalist, the headline of his article, Trump's enemies are proving his conspiracy theories true. Maybe you think actually there are times when it is the job of the civil service to stop governments from doing things. My feeling is, if they've been elected on a ticket and a promise to the electorate, they should be allowed to carry it out. Not to do so undermines the democratic process. Lots of your messages coming in. Paul from Greenwich says, Nigel, I voted for Brexit because I feel it is wrong for unelected European politicians to make our rules and laws. It is also wrong that unelected civil servants are making our policies. Yes, Paul, and we could add, trying to slow down the whole Brexit process. Really good to hear wise words from a decent politician like Obama. Trump, by comparison, is a worm. I suspect he has few friends left. He will be gone soon. I don't think he'll be gone soon, Simon, at all. But he may, after November, be in a much more difficult position in Washington, D.C. Let's go to Joe, a new caller to the show from Edgware. Good morning, Joe.
Good morning, Nigel.
Right, so what do you make of the New York Times article and what his own staff are doing and saying about Trump?
Well, that's kind of my point. In the last sort of half an hour or whatever, you and some other callers have been saying it's the deep state working against him to frustrate his policies. It's the deep state working against Brexit to slow it down and go against the will of the people. It's not the deep state. The man who wrote, the person, I should say, who wrote the article himself said specifically, this is not someone from the deep state. This is someone from Trump's own administration who chances are he himself has appointed. Similarly, with Brexit in the UK, it's not the civil state. It's not some shady cabal of powerful men, interested in the status quo that are slowing down Brexit. It's the Prime Minister and it's her appointed cabinet. And the reason that people like you and like Mr. Trump are pushing this narrative that there's some sort of conspiracy working against us, trying to frustrate the will of the people, is because when it all goes tits up, when the coal plants don't reopen in America, when we've got queues at Dover here, or we're stockpiling food and medicine, it's so you can have someone to blame.
Joe, I would make the point to you that Ollie Robbins is a civil servant. He clearly has won the power game going on for whose vision of Brexit was to win, and that directly has led to the resignation of Boris Johnson, David Davis, and some other more junior.
You think it was primarily Ollie Robbins and not Theresa May and her other Remainer?
Well, I think Theresa May chose their influence over the influence of David Davis, and I would guess
Theresa May, the democratically elected Prime Minister, made the decision, not a mysterious cabal of civil servants. Is that
I think Theresa May was pushed in that direction. Yes, and I think it's very interesting if you look at what Theresa May said at the Lancaster House speech, and you then look, as we go on through the Florence speech and ultimately to the Chequers deal, you see a very, very big change in her position, and I think I think it's likely that the influences of the officials who are with her and around her all day, and probably for half the night, given the hours that job is, have had a significant influence. Yeah, I do actually, Joe, genuinely.
Was she under duress, or is she making these decisions herself based on how politics always works and has always worked?
Well, that's the point. Well, that is the point, Joe, and it may well be that actually this is just the way things have always worked. But there is a feeling. There is a feeling.
Elected officials take advice from their self-appointed advisors.
Well, who's in charge?
Is that what we're rallying against here?
I think what we're asking here. I think what we're asking here is when voters vote for fundamental change, as they did in both the USA and the UK, is it not the job of the civil service to accept that that's the direction of travel for the duration of the term in terms of America, and a change of direction here? And I feel they're not doing that. What say you?
The job of the civil service is I mean, are we talking about the UK here or the United States?
Well, it was about both. I mean, primarily the United States, you know, but I mean, ultimately, you know, advisors advise and ministers decide. That's the way it should be. That was the way Mrs. Thatcher ran her government.
That's the way it is.
Well,
the Prime Minister decides and advisors advise.
Well,
that's exactly what you've just said is happening.
Maybe the advisors have too much power. Joe, I've got to let you go, and a quick apology, folks, there. Joe did use a word we shouldn't be using at this time of the day. You're listening to the Sunday edition of Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's 11:46. And I think later on today, UKIP will be in the news because their NEC meets today to discuss a controversial motion as to whether their party conference should have a debate and a vote on whether Tommy Robinson should join the party. And this morning, Gerard Batten, UKIP's leader, has come out and praised the bravery of the former English Defence League leader. Now, it's interesting because the rules, and I sort of wrote them basically, are that UKIP bans people who are members of far-right groups from even joining the party, but Mr Batten is arguing that a special exception should be made. So I think there'll be a bit of talk about UKIP later on tonight and tomorrow. I think actually politically, UKIP could be in a very good place. There's a bigger and bigger gap opening up on Brexit amongst Labour voters and amongst Tory voters, and the NEC in their infinite wisdom will have to decide whether Tommy Robinson helps people focus on that or not. I won't attempt to influence it. I think I've said enough on this subject already, but it will be interesting. Now, on Twitter, I get, Nigel, you are an unelected, unrepresentative, you should stop trying to influence people, you could be seen as the deep state. Listen, matey, you could argue that every single commentator, every single journalist in the country was an unelected representative, and in case you hadn't noticed, I wish I wasn't really, but I am off to Strasbourg in the morning. We've got a really big week in Strasbourg coming up, including Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, is coming to address Parliament and no doubt get abused by Mr Verhofstadt, and we've got Mr Juncker's State of the Union debate, and I'm going to be in that European Parliament until we leave the European Union. And far from being unrepresentative, actually, do you know what, when I was elected last time, my party came top in the country, so don't give me that. Vicky is calling from Brighton. Vicky, good morning.
Hello, good morning, Nigel. Yes, I certainly think President Trump is being undermined from within. He's not one of the establishment, and people don't like the things he's doing, but he's running America as he sees correctly as a businessman and making it, you know, more jobs, etc. But, you know, with regards to this country, we shouldn't be surprised at all, because Tony Blair, I think, went out of his way to politicise the civil service. And lots of commentators over the years have said this. And so basically, I feel very, very strongly about this. And I think that, you know, you talk about dear Ollie. Well, you know, when you look him up, he's never been in business, he's never done anything. You know, he's just been a civil servant. And I think the whole of the establishment has got these people. And of course, up and down the country, Blair made sure that people who thought like him got into major establishments like the BBC, etc., 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 and this is undermining our whole...
I think you raise a very good point, Vicky. A very good point. It was said that Gladstone gave us the least corrupt, the most honest civil service in the world, and one that acted with political neutrality. And many observers, Vicky, would share your observation that Blair politicised it in many, many ways.
I think he did, yeah, absolutely. Just one other thing I'd like to say. You know, even at a local level, and over the years I've gone to council meetings, etc., sitting in the public gallery and all this kind of stuff. It is absolutely correct that local councillors should have to declare any interest that they have, whether it's shareholdings or local companies or whatever, so that they are not biased and they have to stand away from making decisions. However, that does not apply to council officers, and I think it's completely and utterly wrong, because I've been to enough meetings in the public gallery and sat there and seen people nudge, kind of stick your hand up now kind of effort.
Yeah.
And, you know, the officers have given a recommendation and whatever. Well, how do we know? You know, do we know they're not biased in some way from a personal point of view? Council officers and senior civil servants who are always protected should have to declare interests like shareholdings and companies and all the rest of it.
No,
should.
That's a fair point. Vicky, it's a fair point. The rules should apply both ways. I get that. Civil servants shouldn't advise. They should carry out the will of the electorate, if not leave. I get on Twitter. Well, no, they're allowed to advise. I just happen to think that their advice is just all-consuming, and in many ways it does. Maybe Mrs May's been influenced. I don't know. I'm a civil servant, and I voted out. I think Trump is great, says Dave from Dorset. OK, well, of course, there are some. Nigel, and I've done that one. One irrefutable fact: there has always been a shadow government. Presidents and prime ministers are mere puppets, with the real decisions taking place behind the scenes from unelected officials. Well, I think a lot of us feel that. It may well be that what is happening to Trump is actually not that exceptional. Maybe it happens all the time. Maybe the administration says, well, the president's got this bee in his bonnet at the moment, but you know what? If we shuffle those papers to the back of the pack, give him a real problem to look at, maybe by tomorrow he'll have forgotten about it. Maybe this is how government actually works. I just feel that the establishment, civil services of both countries don't like those big results of 2016 and want to do something to try and change it. And I don't like that. Annie is a new caller from Carnforth in Lancashire. Good morning, Annie.
Oh, good morning. Well, I feel it's quite a good thing if you've got civil service servants who have the courage on occasions to try and frustrate a leader from doing something completely insane. And I think Trump is quite a long way down the road to being an elected dictator. I'd put him on the same par really as Putin and Erdogan.
Hang on, Annie, how's he a dictator? I mean, you know, he is answerable for what he does. He'll be held democratically accountable. If he wants to get legislation through, he's got to put it through two houses on Capitol Hill. I mean, he hasn't got the powers of a dictator, has he?
Well, he can sign all those orders that he was so keen on being, filmed being signed in his office. You know, those orders where he can just basically, put things into motion himself and not have to go through either of the two houses. He's done quite a lot of that, actually, when he first got in. And he's done things like what dictators do, trying to make people believe that they can't believe anything the press says, any of the media, trying to make people believe that you can't trust the judiciary, all those kind of things. And if you look what's just been happening in Germany just recently with all those neo-Nazis on the street, they were shouting slogans, lying press, which is actually a Nazi was a Nazi slogan in the 1930s, and that's what Trump says, fake news all the time.
But I understand why he says fake news, but I genuinely do. I mean, actually, in many ways, the Democrats, Annie, are in such a mess in terms of their leadership in America that it's almost as if CNN and the New York Times have now become the opposition rather than objective press commentators. Annie, I mean, you may disagree totally with the Trump agenda and think it's dangerous, but has he done anything different to what he promised the electorate he would do?
Probably not, but on the other hand, some of the things he has well, I don't know whether he ever mentioned the Paris Climate Accord
endlessly
before. Well, if he did, fair enough, but that's still incredibly dangerous to the world. He's not just a danger to the American people, he's a danger to the world. So, I just think good on the people who are trying to frustrate him from doing anything too completely insane.
And Annie, what about the people who voted for him and want him to do these things?
well, I mean, people voted for Hitler, didn't they?
Not with a majority, no. They did vote for Hitler in very significant numbers, and the German constitution collapsed. Annie, I thank you for your call. I thank all of you for your calls. One way of helping to ensure civil servants do not block the democratic will is to open up the civil service and politics and the media and the professions to normal working class people. Instead, we have a hereditary meritocracy. The upper middle class is only promoting the best from within their own class. Thus says Dominic in Banbury. Be a lot more of Trump over the next 60 days as those midterms approach. You've been listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. I'll be back tomorrow evening at 6. At 3 this afternoon, it's Ian Payne. But up next, it's Majid Nawaz.
Thank you, Nigel.